Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we go after shame any freaking place we can get after it. And that's definitely going to be applicable to today's topic. But before I introduce our guest or the topic, I just want to give you a few heads up about some things that are coming up in the near future. So May 9th is going to be a Reclaiming Female Sexuality retreat, a one-day retreat, which is Mother's Day weekend, which may be a problem for some, but for others, that may be very helpful. I think it's a great way to center the female instead of centering the children to honor it on that day. So if you'd like to participate, it's going to be in person here in the Salt Lake City area. And you can go to my website at natashahelfer.com for further information on that. Or if you want to treat a woman in your life, as long as you're doing that consensually. I don't think it's the type of retreat you want to surprise them to, but if they're willing to go, it might be something you could gift to a woman in your life. Then the first Wednesdays, I just want to say, are free faith transition nights for those who are either can join us in person in the Salt Lake City area or online. And you can get more information about that on our group practice, which is Symmetry Counseling, simcounseling.com. And if anybody needs any resources or referrals or work with me or my providers, that's where you can reach us as well. So that's kind of a little bit of our current events. So without further ado, I have Dr. Michelle Mower, which I'm so excited to be able to call you Dr. Mower, because I know you just recently defended your dissertation, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I'll give a quick bio and then you can introduce yourself more personally. But Dr. Mower is a therapist, a coach, an educator, a certified sex therapist who helps adults understand what's actually going on in their sexuality and relationships. Her work focuses on the erotic mind, how thoughts, desire, and personal history shape the way people experience intimacy. She works with individuals and couples who feel confused, disconnected, or at odds with their own desire, helping them move out of self-questioning and into clarity. Her approach is direct, grounded, and focused on making sense of experiences that often feel hard to explain even to yourself. She's currently completing, although really she has completed because she has defended her dissertation for her PhD in Counselor Education and Supervision. And her research, which is why I'm so excited to talk to you, examines sexual shame in men raised in the Mormon faith and the long-term impact of religious sexual conditioning on their identity and desire. Super excited to get into that. And I had it up here. Hold on just a minute. I'm going to get the actual title is called The Shadow of Virtue, Sexual Shame and Selfhood in Men Raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, presented to Sam Houston State University. Welcome, Dr. Mower.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So excited to have you. I mean, a lot of times, we're talking about purity culture and the conversation goes a lot towards women, right? How women obviously are very affected by being kind of given the role of gatekeeper or, whether or not they have a modesty rhetoric attached to their, religious doctrine and how they're supposed to show up. And we know for women that this really can impede and interfere with the just normal development of sexuality, but even once you're an adult can linger. So I'm so excited that you actually have studied the effects on men in particular. But before we dive into that, tell us more about yourself. Tell us about, how did you come to be a therapist, therapist interested in LDS men, a sex therapist, all those things?
Yeah, all of those things. So, I grew up Mormon. My family is all very active still. So I kind of had the traditional route, got married at a young age. I have 5 children and stayed at home with them for 14 years. And then kind of started just my own journey, I guess you could say, of thinking about the beliefs I was given and the way I was raised related to sexuality, and this is probably 12 years ago now, just kind of re-examining what I thought and what I wanted to do with my life, and just having my kids grow up, like what I thought about sex in general. And I started changing some of my thoughts, right? I just started changing some of the things that I believed and seeing sex in a different way. And I had, we probably all, I don't know if everyone's had this experience, but when I was growing up, in one of the young women lessons, I remember we had a leader brought a pan of brownies and cut it up and said, like, who wants a brownie? And of course, everyone's really excited. And then she said, well, I just want to let you know that I put just a little tiny piece of, she said, dog poo in it, but just a little bit. And
I thought I was the only one that got a poop story.
Did you? Okay. No, I got that too. And so this really
time I'm hearing another object lesson.
With paper.
With my women's leader, it was her baby's diaper. So she had gotten a teaspoon of her baby's, and it was last Sunday. So he was just planning on taking that whole thing back home, because obviously we wouldn't want it. And I was like, I think I might have an eating disorder because I still want it. So I didn't get sexual shame. I got eating disorder shame.
Yeah. So did you eat the brownie?
No, she took it home.
No, she wouldn't okay.
But I knew internally I still wanted the poop brownie. So
you're like, I still want it.
About me.
That's great. I've never heard anyone say, me too, I had that same experience. But so that was my experience. And as I was kind of rethinking things 12 years ago, it bothered me. Because I started thinking, what's wrong with me that I'm okay eating a poop brownie, or that I am thinking differently about this thing that's so terrible. Yeah. And so I sat with it for a while. And there was a moment where I had the realization that sexuality is not the same as poop. Like you just cannot equate them. Yeah. And as soon as that clicked in my brain, it just kind of opened up a whole new world of this example, this object lesson just doesn't even hold up, because it is saying that sexuality is this terrible thing. And as soon as I realized that it's not, that it has the potential to be amazing and incredible, and that I don't see it the same as you might define it using dog poop. Then it just kind of led me down this road of being very curious about people's brains and their minds and what happens with sexual relationships and just the whole thing. And so I was interested in the sex part first, and then I went to get my master's, and I started that in 2018. So I just kind of did the mom thing first, and then went back to school, specifically to become a sex therapist, because that's what intrigued me from the very beginning. Yeah. And so I did the master's, and then got the sex therapy training and specialize in that now. And I see lots of local clients with anything really that's sex related. And so that's
graphically. I'm not.
Are
you in Texas? Where are you at geographically?
Yeah, I'm in Katy, Texas. Yeah, so Houston area.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the like personal story of what led me into the field. And I still find it fascinating. It's my favorite thing to talk about, just to think about what's going on, in someone's brain, and why do, just different things that are sexual in nature and just the way our society views it versus what potentially could be.
Right. Okay. So that's how you find yourself in the field. And yeah, just another comment I have about object lessons. It's either the object itself is sex, which is bad, kind of like the poop, or how you use the sex is bad, like the chewed gum narrative, right? So gum in of itself is not bad, but you wouldn't want it chewed up. And so it's all this value that we have about how sex shows up, which makes it very difficult to sex as one, a developmentally appropriate thing to be curious about throughout the lifespan. And two, even if, because I think the pushback oftentimes is like, but we do see sex as good. We don't see sex as poop. It's just in the right time and at the right place and with the right person and with all the expectations and standards being met. But what I like to remind people is that, parts of our brain and our body don't know that we're Mormon or Catholic or Jewish. They just know whether or not something is safe and pleasurable and fun or not. Right. And so it's difficult to download this idea that sex is only okay in certain conditions or spaces. Is that fair? I don't know what you...
Yeah, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, the brain doesn't work that way. To make those distinctions. And so it can be a confusing experience and then that's really how I started out my research too, is just saying that developmentally, we all go through a sexual development phase. And during adolescence, sexual feelings and thoughts and desires is normative, right? Like it's a normal experience. And what do specifically men, how do they make sense of receiving these messages to stop it, that it's wrong, that it's sinful, that it's a problem, while still having these physical bodily experiences that are undeniable, right? It's part of being human.
Yeah.
And the dissonance there.
So how did you get interested in, out of all the topics you could have chosen in this dissertation, what drove you to study LDS men in particular?
Well, I wanted to do just an LDS population, really just because of my personal background and that it's something that I know well. And I think that the way we make sense of sex has so much to do with our experience, and me being familiar with some of the teachings that can be harmful, that can create roadblocks, maybe you'd say. It was very fascinating to me, and I didn't want to just research myself. That's part of choosing the male perspective, is that I didn't want it to just... It is kind of close to me already, right? Like I was raised Mormon, and I'm interested in this field. And so I wanted to do something a little bit more removed from just me.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything about the fact that here's two people who identify as women talking about men, and you did a study on men, which I know sometimes it's like if men are doing talks and researching on women, we get all kind of riled up about that. How do you think through that? Because I have a lot of different ideas about
it's not my area. Why am I speaking about men? And it's not
our identity, right? It's our experience. And sometimes that's one of the, whether it's, especially in minority populations, like queer populations, male populations, we're like, well, don't study us and research us without our input or us being on the panel. Right. So yeah, what would be your thoughts about if you even would get
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I think as I'm thinking deeper now, I'm like, why did I go, for studying men? A lot of the stuff that was available 12 years ago, maybe, right? It really was about pornography, right? Like pornography addiction and sex addiction. And so I started learning a lot about that. And I think that men really, it's not fair. They really like get a bad, and this is just in general, an overview, right? Like I'm not speaking to any one thing in particular, but the way that it's presented as being so problematic, if I guess I have compassion, or wanting to help men and women, everyone, to see that it's not really how the story that you're hearing is not the true story.
Yeah.
Right. The images that are portrayed, or the idea of what a sex addict or someone using porn. The more I dove into the erotic mind and what is really going on, it's almost like I want to pull back the curtain and say, like, it's not the story that we're presented is not the story under the surface.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're hitting on some really good points. One is that as women, we are affected by the gender wars. As men, we're affected by the gender wars, which are largely systemic. They're all cultural messages that we download about how we show up and what you can expect from the other sex, and et cetera, which is all mostly problematic. And I think too, because I run a lot of men's groups and I ask them this, what's it like, to be in a space, where I'm a woman, and they'll usually say, well, we grew up in patriarchy too. We grew up confessing to men, kind of in a hierarchy with other men. And so to have a woman be in this space is actually very healing. And I have one of our listeners, Joe Rawlings, is saying, I wish more women would show an interest in the trauma and recovery of men from the LDS paradigm, honestly. So I think it is somewhat of a power differential. It's kind of like if I sat with a queer therapist, it was just with a bunch of us women who were straight, I would feel very like, you're a minority too, right? And so that same power differential that I think there exists sometimes when, especially in patriarchal systems, it's the white men who are doing research on Black women or trans lives or, things of that nature, right, including some of those people in their work. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I received the same message from the participants of my study. There was quite a few of them who expressed, because I asked them too, right? I'm like, I know I'm a woman, and here we are talking about your sexual experience, and then they expressed that it was healing to them to have a woman being interested in what their experience was, and not just maybe the belief that we think, oh, this is, I think I know every man's sexual experience because this one story, and we can kind of overlook the individual experience and maybe just some of the real pain and struggle that people experience.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many people who have a story and really just want to be heard and understood.
Right.
And so the research experience I had was just profoundly, I was so grateful for the men who were willing to share their story with me. And I felt, blessed to be able to hear these like honest and raw stories.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, part of the gender war is that male sexuality gets demonized for women. Now, granted, sometimes there's some legitimacy there because, like, as the CNN story just recently, offered us a pretty horrible perspective of what's going on out there. That isn't necessarily, a lot of times it's how we focus on male sexuality from kind of like this sex negative lens. And so I think that's that's important to address. I also wanted to talk a little bit about who were the people who agreed to this? How did you collect your sample? And it sounds like it was a qualitative study versus a quantitative, like it was more oral history taking,
Yes.
like a questionnaire or something like that. So just give us a few thoughts
Yes.
on how you put the study together, how many people participated, et cetera.
Yeah. So it was a qualitative study. Yes. It was specifically, it's interpretative phenomenological analysis, IPA for short. And the methodology of IPA is you take a smaller sample size that is as similar as possible. So as homogeneous as possible to account for, to not have as many differences. And then you go deeper into depth with the data and the personal story. So typically an IPA is about 5 to 10 participants. Okay. is how many people are in a typical IPA study. And I interviewed 8. Okay. So there's 8 men. They were all between the ages of 30 and 50 to kind of have a little bit of a similar experience of the church at a certain time period. And also they needed to be born and raised up until age 18 as members of the church and no longer affiliated.
Okay, so you were really looking for a Mormon perspective, not an active LDS perspective.
Yes, and that was something that I was actually disappointed about. That was something that my dissertation committee pushed back on, is I didn't want to have it be part of the criteria, whether you were active or not right now. But as part of the methodology of the homogeneous sample, my committee said, you need to have it be active or not active. So,
okay. Yeah. Choose one or the other.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because I'm sure that would also add to the differences. Not that active or believing LDS men, because I worked with many of them throughout my career, understood the impact of sexual shame, but I do think that there's a different quality to that once you've left your religious belief system and now can see it through a very different lens. And oftentimes there's more anger and betrayal associated with that post-religious transitioning.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. And really why I didn't want it to be a criteria, because I wanted to have richer experiences. But I do see that it allowed me to zero in more on a specific experience than having the variety of where they might be at right now. But I do think that it would be a completely different study. Yeah. It'd be
interesting to do the study with active men and see what types of differences would come up. So I understand why your committee would have wanted that, because we're trying to get as much variables out.
Yeah.
To keep the population as similar as possible. Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about the questions you asked, or how did you come up with those questions? And then we can talk maybe about the themes that came out of your study.
Yeah. I came up with a list of questions. I don't have them in front of me, so I'm not going to read them, but it really was just, I came up with questions that would help guide me to have more of a conversation, kind of like we are. And so it was not a formal, let me ask a question and an answer, but I had all of these questions to make sure that I was covering everything, but really wanted to hear their experience from their mouth. So if they were telling me a story in a different order, it was not the exact question we were on, I didn't stop and go question by question. But I did ask things like, tell me what it was like in your home growing up. What role did the church play? What messages did you receive about sex growing up? What were you taught in your family? What were you taught in church? What were some experiences you had as you were going through sexual development? What was that like for you? So just kind of questions that helped them tell me their story, and really wanted to see what came up for them. I didn't want to lead too much and I wasn't looking for any specific story or specific answer, but just wanted to know what it was like for them. And so a lot of the men just told me their story, kind of told me like what their family was like, messages they received, things that didn't add up to them, or experiences they had with bishops or stake presidents, mission stories, worthiness interviews, all those kind of things just came up during our conversation. And so then I would follow and just ask more about it and how it impacts them today. And the questions then, I also wanted to know like how sexual shame followed them through their life, the impact it had on relationships, how they view themselves. And so it did kind of take a storytelling chronological approach of just what their personal sexual journey has been. Yeah. So does that help?
Yeah, just kind of like trying to facilitate an open-ended conversation. So if they wanted to share sex positive, sex neutral, or sex negative messaging, the questions would have captured all of that.
Yeah, and I had the questions with me, and I would refer to it just to make sure that everything was covered. But I didn't want to. It was like that's a good way of pointing it out, like not sex positive, not sex negative. I wasn't looking for any. Didn't want it to be a biased thing. Just let me tell me what your experience was.
Yeah. Okay. One of our other listeners, Catherine, is saying, when my male partner deconstructed patriarchy and the sexuality he'd been taught as a male, he had to deal with a lot of sadness over how it affected our relationship and my sexual desire. Men lose out in all of this too, which, yes, none of us win in the gender wars, which is what's so sad about a little bit of what we're seeing. I think a backlash effect with some of these gender messages kind of coming back online with the younger generations. And I'm like, no, we did so much work to try to get you all away from all of this, but here we go again. So yeah. Okay. So I know that your article or your dissertation said there was 4 primary themes that came up, but maybe before we go on the primary themes, why don't you just tell me a little bit about what it was like to listen to these stories and what kinds of things were you hearing that had similar, like, were they having similar experiences in worthiness interviews? Were they having similar experiences on their missions or with their, peers? Or were you finding differences? Were there, like I remember, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson Fife did a similar study, a long time ago for women. And, she, I think she only had about 8 to 15 people, I forget. And there was like 2 that felt like they actually had benefited from a lot of the messages that they got at church, whereas the majority of the women hadn't. So what were kind of some of the things that you were finding?
Yeah. I would say all of them had some sadness. All of them had some feeling of loss or that they had missed out on something. So that was across the board. Everyone expressed, sadness for how they saw themselves, sadness for missed sexual experiences that maybe they had the opportunity and didn't, didn't follow through or feel like they didn't really get to know themselves or explore what they were interested in sexually. There was the thing that was different was the amount of, some people engaged in the repentance process and confession and talking to a bishop, and that was part of their story. And then others were kind of just had the mindset of like, I figured it was none of their business. And I never brought it up. And so that was something that was a little bit different and I don't really know what makes that difference, but just that there are some people in the church experience who have that need to confess and want to talk to a bishop and want to have a conversation. And then there's others who have maybe more inner permission for themselves and grow up thinking like it's none of his business and I'm not going to say anything. And so just hearing those differences of how people navigate, they're all having sexual thoughts, experiences, development, right? Like all of them were, but yet they did approach it all a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting with the confessional piece because anecdotally, I would say, yeah, I usually put young LDS adolescents kind of in two camps. Either they are going to be the confessors or they're going to be the secretive ones. You seem to see that as a positive, like, oh, it's none of his business, which I feel like is an empowered way to keep that private. But that hasn't been my experience with most of these secret keepers. It's like it's more the I don't want to suffer the consequences. I understand that there's a high cost. If I potentially confess about this, I'm not going to be able to pass the sacrament. I'm not going to be able to go on the temple trip with my friends. I'm not going to be able to get the next calling. And so then I'm not going to be able to go on my mission. So it's high cost consequences for being honest. And so they learn that keeping it secretive is protective from those consequences, which then leads to kind of this duplicitous part, which I'm sure we'll talk about in your shame piece, which is if people really knew me,
right,
and they wouldn't want to marry me or have me be the bishop or be, they would see me as not somebody to be a good parent, or which I think is very different than that kid who's like, F you guys, I'm not going to tell you that. That's none of your.
Absolutely.
That's an empowered position, right? Where people to like internally give themselves authority versus the external authority I see more over here. What would you agree with that?
I agree with that. And there were some of both there. And I think partly just the fact that I was speaking with people who have deconstructed and have taken on their own authority. They probably view it a little differently as well. But there were stories of people who had that secretive life or who felt, like they had that, it increased their shame, right? Of not confessing or not talking to the bishop. And then there were also some who had that empowered view of like, it was none of their business. And so I think that there is all of it. Like people have a different experience.
Yeah.
Not everyone experiences the church system the same way, but something that did stand out across the board is that every single one of them made a comment about the silence and thinking it was just them. Like I thought it was only me. And that's something that everyone made comments about, no matter what approach they took. The feeling of something's wrong with me, or if they only knew, like that kind of mindset that they felt singled out. Yeah. That they were sitting in the lesson thinking, if people only knew.
Right.
And that was across the board a theme that everyone talked about.
If people only knew I touched my own penis, or that I think about some of these things in my fantasy world, or that I look at some erotic materials, or those things. Did you find that there was a big diversity in folks who had kept the standards versus not? Because you can be a person who keeps all the standards and still have tons of internalized shame because of your thinking or the fact that I would have even had that thought, or so was there a big difference in the men who maybe had not kept some of the standards versus those who did?
Yeah, and that even when you say it that way, I'm like, ooh, we get a little hair splitting, right? Of like keeping the standards, because I'm like, well, what do we mean by keeping the standards? Because
it's the For Youth pamphlet, you're not even thinking about sex. So.
Exactly, right. And that's why I'm like, well, in that sense, I don't think anyone kept the standards. But then if we want to say like, well, they didn't have sex, maybe, right? If you're going to like have some kind of external
Yeah. So
measurement.
what I'm talking about is masturbation, looking at anything that would be considered pornographic, and having sexual experiences that would be more than just kissing or slight petting, So I would say people who are grinding, having orgasms, giving or receiving oral sex, and having intercourse, right? So,
yeah. And so in that, none of the participants did not participate in masturbation and or some form of like erotic material, pornography, or literature, something like that. So,
which
to me,
with the statistics, right? I mean, just so people know,
yeah,
90, I think it's in the 90th percentile that men say that they've masturbated. I think it's in the high 70th percentile for women. Yes, erotic materials these days are very readily available, and most people, both men and women, have come into contact with those as well, primarily for masturbation purposes, especially when they're single and young.
Yeah. So to me, I think like, oh, that's very normal. Like, and I kind of expected that, and so that's why I pushed back at your question a little bit. I'm like, what do you mean? Because I talked to normal people, right, to humans. And so they had experienced this, and it brought different feelings of shame, right? Just because if you are going by the First Strength of Youth pamphlet, then yeah, they're not keeping the standards. But that's part of the, oh, I'm the only one part, I think, because, the statistics show, and I wonder if they're even higher. I don't know, right? But just how normative and normal sexual development does so often include masturbation and just sexual thoughts and things like that. So my research, it was all of them that had some experience with that.
And I would say anecdotally, again, for me, it's usually in like I don't know, maybe 5% of men that I've seen that really did not do any of those things. And they're usually folks that are highly anxious or on the OCD spectrum somehow, or on the asexual spectrum, or some other thing that's contributing to either them not being interested in sex, or even if they are interested in sex, their anxiety of being good and righteous way overrides in really unhealthy ways these sexual drives.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. And there were, one participant did say that on his mission he abstained the entire 2 years. And that was a impactful experience for him, that he did not have any masturbation the whole 2 years. And then within like a week or two of getting home, it shifted, and how devastating. He spoke about how devastating that was, how he felt like I had been so good and I had done all this work, and now I've just lost it all. And just the pain that can be when you're viewing it through that lens of you've just lost it all this that you worked for.
Yeah. It's so, this whole theme is just so unnecessarily tragic, sadly. Because it's one thing to have the standard of premarital sex, which is already problematic in some ways, to have that expectation, but to have this expectation that you can't even be within your own self and your own body is just so unrealistic. And I agree with you. Even the mission thing, I think a lot of men would be surprised to know that for the most part, I would put it like in the 70th percentile, maybe, if I was just going to think about my clientele of men who've said that they did masturbate on their mission. So even then, I think a lot of men would be surprised and think, oh, I was the only one who snuck one in everyone in a while or something. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's just perpetuating that I'm the only one view.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So let's go into these 4 themes. The first one was really about, so I'm just going to list your sentences from your dissertation. It says, sexual shame developed early within a religious context, characterized by moral regulation and limited discussion of sexual development. So I think here you're really talking about early years, right? moral regulation probably being things like worthiness interviews as young as 11 and 12 years old, maybe messages they're getting at home of not doing certain things, and they're not being offered comprehensive sexual education, which is a problem really. It's much bigger than just Mormonism, but definitely includes Mormonism. So yeah, let's talk about that first point.
Yeah. So that's exactly a really great summary. Just that it wasn't sexual development as far as learning about their body or what they were experiencing, or even just what sexual feelings, like the positives and the biology of it. It was through this moral lens of this is wrong and this is bad. And the silence, that was a big theme, the silence of what we maybe just describe as sex positivity, right? The only message they did receive was more of the law of chastity. And this is to be saved and not to be used. And so the isolation of not having sex ed or conversations about it just led them to have to grapple with this on their own as a young child that didn't really fully understand what was happening anyway, and then to have this moral lens on top of it.
And what do you mean by moral regulation? Are you meaning like the regulation of the interviews, of like regulating them? Is somebody checking to make sure they're...
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is the belief, the systemic belief that you should not think about this, you should not feel this way, this is not something that you should participate in until you're married. That messaging, that was an overlay of what their body was experiencing. So when they would experience, maybe having an erection or being turned on or having a sexual thought, instead of being able to make sense of that or understand themselves, it was an immediate, oh no, this is bad, this is a problem. And so they didn't have the chance to learn their body or learn themselves without this judgment.
Yeah. And boys are getting erections and from very early ages, that doesn't happen at puberty.
Right.
I remember little kids of mine, or even kids I would babysit, be like, kind of like, look at me and look at what happened. And
right.
That's happening at a pretty early age, 3 to 6 years old. They're starting to notice what's happening with their genitals. And I was very sex positive with my boys. So I'd be like, oh yeah, that's an erection. That's what happens. No biggie. Mm-hmm. But I'm imagining a lot of boys probably got messages that were very different and pretty quickly ran into the anxiety of parents who also don't have comprehensive sexual education and who have been taught to be anxious about their boys' sexuality. And so,
like,
oh no, we don't talk about that, or put that away, or, and so those simple messages start giving that anxious response of, oh, this isn't safe to talk about. This isn't safe to express. And then you start getting the religious messaging on top of all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a theme that was across all of them. All the stories were unique, right? Like all of the way that they experienced that was unique. But that storyline of exactly how you laid it out, with these physical things are happening, and yet the messaging that they're receiving is that it is not okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this first theme is really about external. You've got a little kid who's trying to collect data from the world, and he's collecting data that says, oh, there's something bad or dangerous or naughty or hands off about your own body and emerging sexual identity. Mm-hmm. The second theme was shame became internalized now. So this is different. This, it's one thing to receive messages. It's then a whole nother thing to be like a sponge and absorb the messages, which is what we're talking about when we say internalize. So Shame being internalized through ongoing self-monitoring now, moral evaluation, shaping participants' sense of identity. Okay, by all means, tell us more.
Yeah. So really just the participants spoke about they then took on this belief and that they were a problem, that their sexuality was problematic, and that they would begin monitoring how good have I been, or am I worthy? And it was not necessarily coming externally at some point. Like they internalized this voice in their own head or the way that they viewed themselves. One participant shared a story about his father saying, "Oh, have you been looking at pornography? Something's off, I can tell." And he said, like, he was surprised. He's like, "No, I actually hadn't." He even used the words, like, I think in his exact words, "I've been good for a month." And it made me realize I needed to do a better job at hiding my emotions.
Wow.
Because they thought that's what was happening. And so
if their young son was irritable or in a bad mood or struggling maybe with something at school or stressed out about something, the parent's immediate worry and concern is, oh no, your countenance has changed.
Yes.
So this means that you're looking at porn.
Wow. And that was really just an example of how that became internalized. That messaging that, oh, people around me are seeing this. And so then this participant began noticing himself more and monitoring his emotional expression to avoid people thinking that he had been looking at pornography. Or that's just one of the examples. But all of their participants had some form of self-evaluation of deciding whether, they wore a white shirt or not on Sunday, or whether they, some stopped attending sacrament meeting for a while, not wanting the public view of not taking the sacrament. That was his way of, he said, like, the bishop didn't tell me this. No one told me. I did it myself because I didn't want to be unworthy or defile the vessels, is the actual words he used. And so there was a theme of, I will monitor myself because I don't want to be. This shame is motivating me to not be this sinner of this picture they had in their head of what a sexual sinner is.
Yeah. Which is, it's a pretty big deal in our culture, right? Because we talk about sexual sin like it's the second thing to murder, and that, it's better that people, like whatever horrible scripture there is about, it's better that you put a noose around somebody's neck. Of course, that has to do with abusing children, but a lot of times the young people don't have the developmental acuity or ability to understand the difference between an adult perpetrator, who should be talking about in those kinds of cases, versus their own, oh, I'm a sexual sinner because I touched my own, testicles or my own penis. Oh my goodness. And your sentence here ending in the sense of identity is where I'd like to just spend a few minutes with this identity of considering yourself diseased or sick, which is what we do through the pornography and sex addiction language, which you had earlier mentioned that. And I want to be very clear every time we talk in that language that the audience understands we're not collaborating with that language. We are challenging that language, right? That is actually inaccurate clinical language. And nothing drives me battier, Michelle, than going on my Utah Therapists page and in search of ISO, somebody who can help 15-year-old with porn addiction. I'm like, there's LDS complicity in the therapy community.
Yeah.
That 90% of these cases, this isn't even problematic sexual behavior. It's only problematic because it doesn't align with their religious values, which is a problem, but that's not a clinical problem. That's a values discrepancy problem. And even with the 5% or so of people, 5 to 8% that maybe do struggle with compulsivity, impulsivity, control, it's not helpful to look at it through an addictions model. We have to really understand, is there ADHD on board? Is there compulsive control issues, which are very diagnostic, assessment type questions, especially with a young person. But you can see how this is what drives me so nuts, because when you look at sexuality through the addiction model, what it does not do is it does not normalize sexual drive.
Right.
None of us have a natural drive where every few days we just have to have cocaine. And we're just like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do without cocaine? And all of us are born with that cocaine dependent drive. But we do have that for hunger, and we do have that for thirst, and we do have that for sleep, and we do have that for sexuality. And we differ widely as humans as far as how much our sexual drives are on point. And none of us are going to die if we don't have sex like we would if we didn't have food or water, but it's still a human drive of sorts.
It is a drive, yeah.
And we attach that to an addiction model, which and says the fact that you have this desire means that you are perpetually diseased to begin with. And so, of course, everybody, when you apply it, it seems to make sense. Well, you have this drive and it doesn't go away, and you need to monitor it. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, it's like saying it's drinking water,
right? Or you need to stop sleeping.
So anyway, get me off my soapbox and tell me what you're thinking about what I'm saying.
No, I absolutely agree with everything. I get right on the soapbox with you. So a story comes to mind of one of the participants. He said it was like being told, it was like needing to sneeze, that feeling of having to sneeze and being told that you were bad for sneezing and that you needed to hold it in. And that's how he described coming to going through his sexual development and all of that, of kind of that drive, right? Like that it's an innate thing. It's going to happen. And it's not, and I would go back to my own experience with the dog poop, right? It's not something that's wrong. It's not something that's bad. And I do think that's probably why the addiction model also falls apart so much, is because it is not a problematic drive.
Yeah.
And sure, people might not use their sexuality the best, and there can be problematic use, and there can be issues. And even there were some participants who spoke about abusive experiences and harmful, non-consensual sexual experiences, and all of that exists. But it's not because the sex drive itself is problematic. And so that was a big thing of the participants just making sense of that and trying to figure out their own experience of this thing that they were told was either an addiction, like a lot of them went to the 12-step program or were labeled as an addict, versus coming to a place where they could take ownership of it and see that this is not, it's not a bad thing. And they're really all across the journey with that. Like some of them had more experience at accepting their sexuality and embracing it. And there were others who were still on that path of not exactly sure where, how to view their own sexuality.
Yeah. And I really want to invite the audience to sit with this for a minute, because when you think about young, tender, underdeveloped brains, and we already know that boys kind of tend to develop a little slower than girls of the same age, and you are asking them to identify as diseased because of something that's normal for them, how incredibly life altering that is. I
Mm-hmm.
can't tell you how many people I've spoken with, people who identify as men who've said something like, well, I had a crush on this really amazing, girl. She was the seminary president, or she was, like just so lovely. And I could not even begin to think that I could go after somebody like that or pursue somebody like that because I am so dirty and so bad. I think of like ADHD kids, right? That we've done a lot of education on how these kids in the educational system for a long time were labeled by their parents or teachers as lazy or
Right.
and they internalize and they believe it. They believe it. These
Right.
community fulfilling prophecies. So when you believe you are lazy or stupid, you don't go for the college degree. You're like, I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
do that, right? Or you don't believe you're worthy for the next promotion or at work, and so it affects so much of how you see yourself in the world. And when you see yourself as sexually diseased, this I think is actually very psychologically abusive what we're doing, and we're not calling out church entities, I think, sufficiently for understanding the harm, the psychological abuse and harm
Mm-hmm.
that this causes so many individuals. So I'm really glad that you touched on this identity piece.
Mm-hmm.
The third part then is sexual shame also, and this is so important too. I'm going to get on a soapbox here. Sexual shame also functioned as a barrier within intimate relationships. Doesn't all magically get better when you get married. Instead,
No, it does not.
it created so many problems that now they're
Mm-hmm.
going to express themselves in these marriages, disrupting disclosure, emotional closeness, and sexual connection. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, please expand on that.
Yeah. And I felt really just so honored that participants shared their stories with me, because a lot of them are in the middle of this, right? It's not a nice, neat story where it's even solved, right? There's a lot of them who, shared the disconnection they feel of maybe not being able to fully express themselves sexually to their spouse, or being afraid that it would hurt. Some of them have described like, I can't tell her because it will hurt her. Just the fact that the sexual thoughts they have, or just their sexual desires. There's some stories of the confession cycle, related to porn use, of confessing and then feeling better, and the pressure that put on the relationship. And, stories that we've heard these stories. There's no way around when sexual shame takes root, there's no way that it cannot impact a relationship.
Right.
And it just impedes the closeness. And it both individuals in the relationship, a lot of the men talked about, and these were all heterosexual men, which is also a limitation of the study. But so that they talked about their wives and how they had their own sexual experiences and sexual shame, and how it interacted differently in all of the relationships. And some of the relationships had ended, and some were considering, separating, and others had worked through this journey together. So huge range of details of where people took this in their life, but every single participant struggled with navigating a relationship and their feelings of sexual shame.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I could just list off 20 different ways, but I do think that we for heterosexual couples, I mean, if you don't fall into that category, you've got 500,000 other problems, but at least for heterosexual couples, the church like functions that's the ideal. And so you're in that box, but you've been given nothing but unrealistic expectations, zero communication skills, zero sexual comprehension about your anatomy or your partner's anatomy. I mean, it's kind of a miracle that any of these couples end up having good sex lives, which many do. I'm not, but the themes that are very prevalent are oftentimes some level of dishonesty. If you can't even be honest with yourself, how are you going to be honest with another person? Plus, even if you are being honest with yourself, but you're like, oh, that part of me is really naughty and bad, so I can't share that part of myself with my partner. And I think men are given very much that protective kind of narrative. You're to protect these, daughters of God that are so fragile and beautiful. And wonderful. So if my sexuality is going to harm my precious fragile wife,
right, I don't want to hurt her, so I will hide it.
I will hide it. And then there's this duplicity, right? And also I think entitlement is also part of shame. Like, oh, I was shamed not to have sex, but now I should be able to have sex. So now I can show up entitled to have sex. So that's a problem relationally, that almost your wife owes you sex. Or the other side of that is, I don't have a right to be sexual because that's, the natural man in me. So I'm just going to do whatever my wife is comfortable with. And so I just won't ever advocate for myself. I mean, so many things.
So many things. Yes.
And these are just the ones at the top of my head. So,
yep. Yeah. And that's what I found too, is that there's a variety of how it shows up, but it will impact your relationship. There is no way around it. And every participant's story there was raw pain in all of them. And really, and a lot of longing and sadness.
Yeah.
And I think that even just having people aware, like that is a very common experience. And that's, you're not alone. People who are going through this in their relationship or in themselves and trying to navigate their own feelings, their own sexuality and shame they might have and how it's showing up in their relationship. Like, it's not something that you're going through alone. And it's not something that's wrong with you. It is a very common and really unavoidable part of a relationship. And that really was just the theme, is just saying that, like, this does happen, and how people, I go into more detail in the actual paper of how it shows up for specific people, because that's going to be unique, right? Everyone's story is different, and how people decide to work through this is different. But the fact that you have to kind of face your sexuality, your partner's sexuality, what do we want to do with this? Like, how do we communicate? How do we navigate this? It's a very normative experience.
Yeah, I've always really liked the metaphor of getting naked with somebody. We do that literally on, I guess, honeymoon night, but it's a whole nother thing to really get naked erotically and sensually and to be known. And if all we feel like we can show is our shiny parts without knowing all the underbelly of, which is really what's so titillating and erotic, we're missing out on really knowing each other. But if it doesn't show up shiny and comfortable, then we're taught that that's threatening and bad. And that's oftentimes the disconnect between couples, is they can't really talk about those things.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so your last theme is kind of a more positive one, and I apologize that I've got something going on.
Okay.
Anyway, says, finally, participants described a gradual process of renegotiating sexual meaning, which involved questioning inherited beliefs, loosening self-surveillance, and developing new ways of relating to desire in the body. So that seems like there was some level of shifting, maybe away from shame.
Yes. And I think this kind of, again, is because I did have people who were no longer affiliated with the church. They have gone through some kind of reconstructing process or deconstruction of their beliefs. And so, people spoke about, the shame didn't go away. A lot of them spoke about they changed their beliefs, but the shame stayed. That the shame took longer. And for a lot of them, it's not gone, but they have a better understanding and more internal confidence and permission for themselves, even when the shame kind of shows up sometimes. And so it was a renegotiation of how they view sexuality for themselves. But also there was a sense of sadness and incomplete, and that it's a process that they've made progress on, but there's none of them really were like, and now I've arrived, and now it's amazing, and I have it all figured out. Like there's still an ongoing, things that show up or relational concerns that they're still navigating. And so the idea of changing how they see themselves sexually is empowering and exciting and positive. And then also there's this sadness of the truth that there are missed experiences or ways that they see themselves now of the sadness of the shame their younger self went through, or just the impacts that it has had on all different areas of their lives. Sitting with that now brings sadness, and changing their belief feels empowering. And so they really like holding space. It was a balance of both, where it's this non-linear process that is continuing to unfold and is beautiful and exciting and sad.
I really appreciate you explaining, or I guess languaging those things as different, changing your beliefs versus having shame, dissipate, because one is more of an intellectual process and one is more of an emotional process. And as a sister in ex-Zion with these men with them, I very much resonate with that. I mean, my beliefs have changed dramatically about a lot of things, sexual health principles, sexual behaviors, all relational structure things. And shame persists, even for me today. I try to be very open about that because I don't want people to think, oh, she's got it all figured out. But this is why I see it as a trauma response, because also as a survivor of sexual abuse, and a trauma therapist, I always tell people the goal here is not to heal completely, meaning, oh, I'll never think about it again, I'll never be impacted.
It goes away. Yeah.
Trauma is trauma for a reason. It will more than likely, you'll be in a relationship with that trauma for the rest of your life. It's kind of like physical trauma too. I have a bum knee from skiing, and
it's going to be there.
Had a surgery, it got some therapy on it, but it still is a little weaker, and I have to think both psychologically and physically. When I ski, I can still ski, but it's different than if that trauma hadn't happened.
Right.
So it is sad. And it's angering because we're like, well, why did this happen to me? Why did this trauma come? And so whether it's a individual perpetrator who actually came and hit you over the bat, or if it's a system who basically hit you over the bat with a bunch of negative messaging about your own self and body, we are dealing with trauma here, which is why we call it religious trauma these days, and we're getting more and more acceptance of that being a very legitimate term. So it's a process, and you can improve, and you can have a lot of tools and strategies, and it can have much less of an impact than it used to, and yet it will be more than likely an ongoing relationship.
Yeah, I think that it's somber is kind of the word that comes to my mind. Is there's sitting with that of, yes, it will be an ongoing relationship that you have with this experience from your past, and it doesn't have to stay as painful or as impactful, but it will be there.
Yeah.
And I think that also is helpful in, as we talk as clinicians about healing, or what does that even mean? Because if someone thinks it needs to go away for them to be healed, that doesn't happen.
It's also a realistic expectation.
Right. I'm like, it's unrealistic.
We don't want to measure ourselves by all these unrealistic expectations, right? And we did come from a culture that gave us a lot of unrealistic expectations about how we're going to human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it takes the driver's seat, right? Like the trauma experience, like yes, it happened and it's part of your history or part of your beliefs or the way your brain works, but that it can be re-examined and rearranged. And there were many stories of being empowered to, people talking about they no longer see sex and morality so linked, right? Maybe how they see it differently, or how they've rearranged their relationship, or just a lot of triumphs at the same time as acknowledgement of the sadness.
Yeah.
And I found it beautiful just to hear the experiences and kind of just end with, like, it's not tied in a nice bow, and it's not over, and it's not easy, but it's very real and so relatable, just so human that, I think there's a power for people realizing that they're not alone, and that what they're experiencing has potential to be beautiful and amazing, as well as some difficult moments.
For sure. Yeah. I love that invitation to really consider purity culture, religious sexual shame, trauma as a community experience. Most of us have experienced it. Not all of us are aware of it, especially more on the believing side still. There can be a lot of inability to see your own oppression, but especially those who have left and are going through a reconstruction story after deconstruction. I think I really love your metaphor of it no longer has to drive the car. It's like, okay, how do we take it from driver's seat to passenger seat, then maybe to the back seat? And I would say my section is now a little box in the trunk, and it a lot of fun driving around. And yet every now and then it clinks in a way that it reminds me it's there. And I have a lot of tools and strategies to deal with it. It's still frustrating that I have to deal with it at all, which is what I mean by that, kind of anger that kind of still sometimes, or sadness or somberness, but it does not mean that you cannot have a very fulfilling life or fulfilling relationship, especially if you're willing to become self-aware, see how these things you, if you're partnered, hopefully have an ally in your partner who also has been more than likely impacted by many of these messages as well. So I'm so glad that you focused on this as your dissertation. Are there any closing thoughts before? I know I've kept you way over time, so I apologize.
Yeah, no, you're good. No, I really appreciate the conversation. I know I don't think anything of this research was, groundbreaking, or we've never heard this before. But I do think that there's so many experiences that people have that aren't in maybe what we would call the literature, right? It's not researched, it's not studied, and especially the Mormon lens, just the difficulty that it was for me to navigate the academic space, trying to portray, to my committee and to my chair, no, this is why it's different, or this is why it's not the same as mainstream Christianity, or, just there is something, and it's not only Mormonism, right? There's a lot of other belief systems, but there is a unique experience that I think is important to be heard, and for people to know that they're not alone, and that it's not the end of their story.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think a lot of times in literature, religion gets kind of put in a big monolith. Know that the sexual shame experience is going to be much different in a higher demand or higher control religion than a more flexible or progressive religious community. We also know that, Jehovah's Witness sexual shame story is not going to be the same as a Catholic sexual shame story, is not going to be the same as a Muslim or Orthodox Jewish story
Right.
or Mormon story, right? And so we all have our unique kind of messaging of how we download those ideas that impact not only our identities, but our relationship with spirituality, our relationship with sexuality, and our relationship with other people we eventually might have sex with. So,
Yep. Yeah. And I think I would just like to close by saying how deeply honored I was to have the participants share with me. And also the outpouring of people who were willing to participate was so much more than I had the ability to participate in the study. But I, just how appreciative I am of the people who are willing to share. And, people want to share. They want to be heard. They want to help others. And I'm so grateful for the experience to just be a small part of that process for them. So.
I love that. Well, it's in the sharing that a huge component of healing happens, whether it's the sharing or the helping or the listening, and why I think podcasts are popular to begin with, especially ones that center on people's stories. So I think thank you so much for doing this work and for being interested in this topic. I'm also very interested in it. I'm just not a researcher.
Yeah.
But I definitely am very interested in working with people who are struggling with these things. Will you give us permission to share your dissertation on our show notes or things like that? Yeah. Or a way that they can access this dissertation that you'd rather them go to?
Yeah, you can share it in the show notes. So I'm good with that. And I also have a website, michelle-mower.com. If anyone's ever, interested in speaking with me or anything like that. And I'm just excited to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
That's right. You work with people, so people can work with you and call you, see if they can schedule an appointment with you or whatever. We'll definitely put your website in the notes as well. So if people want to reach out to you directly,
okay.
That. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I hope our paths cross again soon. And
yes, thank you.
Having you on today.
Thank you, Natasha. Have a great rest of your evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Na tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Naughtisch geschieht alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Naughtisch geschieht alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland.